All right, let's talk about the basics of getting a virtual machine installed on your Windows physical host. Okay, now for this example, I'm going to use my own personal home computer. I'm going to build a Windows 10 VM called something along the lines of delete me Win 10. But it is important to note that I could be doing this inside an Azure VM with nested virtualization turned on. Totally separate topic here. Okay, so Hyper-V is a role that can be installed on your Windows workstation, Windows 10, Windows 11, can be installed on a Windows server. Okay, here, for purposes of our test environment, I installed the role. I am going to create a simple Windows 10 VM. Now, the VM is already up and running here in the background. You can see it's doing updates, but I'm going to walk you through the process of how that got built. Okay, so a couple of things to show you before we get started. I have gone to the Microsoft Evaluation Center. Now, it's been 5 months. If you look at the date modified versus today's date, you'll notice that these ISO files are not the brand newest, which is fine. If you go to Google and search for Microsoft Evaluation Center, the first link will take you to the home page. Across the top are tabs for current and older versions of Windows. If you wanted to do an Office 365 deployment, there is a whole lab environment here. Time permitting, I would love to go over this with you. But time permitting for you, don't be afraid to download one, the other, or both of these, and then give them a test in your own environment. Okay, Windows Server, the brand newest, all the way back to Server 2012. I can download just Server Essentials, just Hyper-V, Admin Center. I can download SQL Server, etc. Okay. Also, if you want the latest iteration of whatever you're trying to test, you could just evaluate Windows 11 right here, or Windows Server right here. These are modified as regularly as new feature updates are released. Okay. I have downloaded these files a little bit earlier. These are the disk installation images. So I'm using air quotes here when I say this is the Windows 10 DVD. Okay, we're going to mount this ISO file as a virtual DVD drive. Okay, the other item I wanted to show you, and we'll come back to this, on my data volume, my D drive, I always create a separate folder called VMs. And inside this, I will manually create a folder that matches the name of the virtual machine I'm working with. Okay, I'm trying to avoid some confusion. 6 weeks to 6 months from now, if I would come in here and my machine was just named Win 10. Well, that's very descriptive. What was that machine for? And unless I've taken copious notes, I'm not going to remember. Okay, so I try where possible, especially in my test environment, to name my VMs something where I can look at it quickly and, oh, okay, this is just a test that I'm safe to delete. This is Kali Linux for an upcoming security class I'm teaching. This is the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit for an upcoming certification exam I'm studying for. Okay, so pick a naming convention that makes sense to you, stick to it, and if you're OCD like me, make sure that you name the folder that holds the virtual hard disk file, matches the name. It will make it easier on you in the future. Okay, so I'm going to go through the steps, but because I already have one completed, right before I finish creating a new VM, I'm going to hit cancel. Okay, so I'm going to right click on my host name. I'm going to choose new. I'm going to choose virtual machine, okay, because I'm building one from scratch. Please do not get into the habit of clicking next, 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 finish. A 3-year-old could click the next button. Not going to get you hired as a Windows Server administrator. Please remember, before someone hires you to manage their very expensive, potentially very complicated infrastructure, you're going to have to pass a verbal interview. That verbal interview might include questions that are answered by these screens that you next, and fly through. Okay, so I've been doing this for a long time. I don't do that. I want to see the screen every time. Okay, but again, that's just personal preference. What do you want to call your VM? And whatever name you give it here is the name that's going to appear here in this column. Okay, so I'm going to do a little riff on this. This is going to be workstation 02. I am not going to modify this setting, although if you're doing this at work, your storage administrator or your policies might dictate you don't store things locally on the server. Maybe you have a network storage location, a SAN, a NAS device. Then you would click this box, you would change the path. Okay, I'm not going to do that. I've had some significant issues with Windows 10 Gen 2. Theoretically, Gen 2 is the latest, the greatest. It supports only 64-bit. It supports the UEFI BIOS and not legacy BIOS. But I'd say 50 to 70% of the time, especially in test beds, I create a Windows 10 VM, I reboot it, it works fine. I do some updates, I reboot it, it refuses to boot. I get a SCSI boot device failure, and I end up spending more time troubleshooting. So for my test bed devices, Gen 1 is fine. It won't support the latest and greatest, but it does everything I need it to do in this particular environment. Now again, this is a Windows 10 box. My physical host has 64 gigabytes of memory, so I can afford to be a little more, assign a little more memory than I might otherwise. Something else I like to do is assign dedicated or dynamic memory as opposed to dedicated or static memory. I'll show you how to limit the amount of memory a VM can potentially take later. Please do bear in mind, though, if this is a production environment, you have to be careful not to run the host server out of disk space or memory, which is a concern depending on the number of VMs you have. Okay, 2 gigs to start. Do keep in mind that the number you type in there has to be some version of 1024. Okay, so if I want 2 gigs of memory, it's 2000 isn't going to cut it. Okay, 2048. We'll talk about virtual networks or VNets later. My physical machine is connected to the external world via an Ethernet cable. I created a separate internal only network for testing Active Directory domain services. Machines connected to this network do not get direct access to the internet. I do want direct access to the internet because that's how I'm going to get Windows updates in my test VM. Do I want to create the virtual hard disk? And that is where this folder comes in handy. Now, I'm going to create a new folder here. And this would be Workstation 2. Then I would copy this path and I would paste it into this field. I don't want that file on my C drive. I want it on my D drive. And I also want to limit the amount of space. Be careful not to under-allocate. First set of Windows updates is going to fill that hard disk. This VM will never boot again. Do I want to install an operating system later? How about right now? That's where this comes into play. I'm going to copy, this path. That path has been pasted in here previously because I've done this before. Windows 10, open, and I'll hit cancel here instead of finish. I hit cancel here because I've already got a VM built. So had I hit finish instead of cancel, what would have happened is you would see delete me -win10-02 right here, and it would be off. And if I would right click it or double click it, right click it and choose connect or double click it, this is the screen I would get. Okay. I always like to double click or right click and connect first, because then, especially when I have multiple VMs open, I can kind of cascade one atop the other like this, but I can still see the title bars for both, so I know which VMs I have open, right? Because down here, I have two different windows, but sometimes it's hard to read the title, especially if you're using long names for the names of your servers. Once I have the window in the position I want, I would hit start. Now, before I would hit start, though, I'll right click and hit settings. Now I'm doing that on this one because this is the one I built a little while ago. This one is running, so some of the settings I will not be able to change. But if I right click on one that's powered off and go to settings, this is what you'll see. I can change the VM I'm working on by using this drop down. Okay, we're doing this one. Dynamic memory, you can see I started with 2 gigs. I enabled dynamic memory. A minimum of 512 is the default setting. Maximum of 1 terabyte is the default setting. Well, Windows is smart enough to know I've only got 64 gigs of RAM on this machine, not a terabyte. It's not going to try to allocate a terabyte. But physical and virtual memory allocations together, okay, I like to have a little more control. Because this is a workstation, I'll limit it to 4 gigs. Right? If this were a virtual SQL server or virtual Exchange server, I might specify 32 gigs and 32 gigs. So the RAM minimum and maximum would all be the same. Okay, that may save me some time slices per se. The machine is always going to get 32 or whatever number I specify here. Processors, the default is 1. You can only change this if the box is turned off. Please be careful. I had this set to 4 when I came in here. Have I booted this VM before? Have I run Windows updates? If I come in here and modify that, I might have to go through activation again because I just cut the number of processors in half. Okay, I'm going to hit cancel here. Okay, so that change won't take effect. My delete me machine, the other things I want to show you can be done from here. This is the hard drive that I specified. Now, we'll talk more in a later lesson about what I'm about to show you, specifically that file. This is the virtual hard disk, the extended VHD file. Notice that its file size is 4 megs. This is the file that gets created while the VM is running. I'm doing Windows updates, I'm installing Microsoft Office, I'm installing antivirus, I'm downloading group policies, blah, blah, blah. All of those changes get written to this file. At some point, this file will get combined with that file, and this file will then become approximately this size plus that size. A maximum of 30 gigabytes because that's what I set it up for. Okay, again, we'll talk more about the A VHDX files a little bit later. Okay, and we can see that I've got the Windows 10 DVD mounted. Please do keep in mind, every time I reboot this VM from now until the end of time, as long as this is happening, that little black screen at the BIOS when you first boot up, it's going to say press any key to boot from DVD. And if you mistakenly hit the space bar or the enter key while the machine is booting, it's going to boot from the DVD and not from the hard drive. And it's going to ask you if you want to rerun Windows setup again. You can avoid that by doing this. Okay, so let's hit OK there. Once that's done, you connect to this VM. Okay, you hit Action and Start. Now, I don't have Start as an option because it's turned on. The machine boots from DVD, the initial boot, and you set up Windows exactly the way you would set up Windows from scratch. You answer all the questions. Upon first reboot, do you want to set up Cortana? It's going to ask you, do you want to use a Microsoft account? Now, I don't expect you to remember this, but we'll talk about this later. During that part of the setup phase where it's asking you to use a Microsoft account, this machine, I'm logged in as a user called user. Just straight user with no password. In order to do that, I had to set up what's called a local account. When the screen is asking me to set up my Microsoft account, down in the lower left corner will be a link that says Domain Join Instead. You click that, then you'll get the type your user ID here that you want to use, and I type the word user. Then it will say type a super memorable password. I leave that field blank. If you put a password in that field, it's going to ask you to fill in the 3 security questions. What's the last name of your childhood best friend, right? The color of your first cat, your mother's maiden name, right? All those goofy questions. I get around that by just user is my name and password is null. There's nothing in that field. It takes anywhere from 3 minutes to 43 minutes, depending on the speed of your physical host, depending on the resources you've given this. You can see right now it only has 2 gigs of memory. Okay, I believe I gave this machine 2 cores and not 4 cores. That's okay. And you can see that I have Windows 10 Enterprise set up for 90 days. The evaluation copies of Windows operating systems, workstation operating systems, are good for 90 days. Server operating systems are good for 180 days. But you can rearm them 5 additional times. So I can get, I believe, 1.5 years out of this Windows 10 evaluation VM. I can get up to 3 years out of these evaluation copies. Okay, if you can't pass the certification exam you're studying for in 18 or 30 months, maybe it's time to pick a new career field. But that's the end of the simple installation, right? Again, a quick summary. You have to install the Hyper-V role on the physical host you're using. The physical host can be your machine at your house. It could be an Azure virtual machine with nested virtualization. An Azure virtual machine will support additional virtual machines inside it. We'll talk about nested virtualization later. If a reboot is required, give it a reboot, launch Hyper-V Manager, start building your VMs. Don't forget, though, to build your VMs, what operating systems do you want to run, right? You can see I've got a couple of distros here of Linux, including Kali. I've got Windows 7 around here somewhere. In fact, I think I have, yep, a Windows 7 machine built. Download the ISOs that you want to test, and then start thinking about how do you want to carve up the resources on your physical host. If this is a machine with 4 cores and 8 gigs of RAM, you can build this many VMs. Don't try to run them all at the same time, however, right? Please keep that kind of thing in mind. Okay? And once it's built, you run this exactly the way you would run a standalone physical machine. I can install Windows updates. I can forcibly reboot. I can install Microsoft Office on this if I like. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you all in the next video.